Who the heck knew I was going to give you a cliffhanger in this one? So the results weren't hypothesized, but they were compelling. And that's the problem. If it's not part of your hypothesis, you can't claim it. You might observe a compelling result, but that means, hey, that looks interesting. So now I have to redesign the experiment with my observation in this experiment as the hypothesis for the next experiment. That's the way to do legit science. And you got to know that Marilyn Brewer is not going to allow any cheating on that whatsoever. Right? So my first methods class at Ohio State, graduate methods class, was with Marilyn Brewer, and she is Dr. Methods. Right? So for all that work, hundreds of participants, countless hours in the lab, right? What do we find? Well, females in the fear step back felt most comfortable, while males in the same condition felt least comfortable. It's that last question I asked, how comfortable. I really didn't think that question would generate any responses. I don't know why I'd included it. But think about it. Females in the fear step back felt most comfortable. Males in the fear step back felt least comfortable. Now, women in our society are allowed to avoid fearful stimuli. Men, since the time we're boys, are told that we have to face our fears and that we have to approach them. Wow. Marilyn was like, oh my God, that's crazy. you have to redo the experiment and we got to replicate that. And I said, yeah. The effect was reversed in the fear step forward condition. Women in the fear step forward said they felt least comfortable, and men in the fear step forward felt most comfortable. So we thought we were onto something. So, the non-conscious priming, the bodily involvement, cultural expectations, all that stuff together combined to yield some surprising results. And we replicated it, but the problem is I changed the study quite a bit to streamline it. I was running out of time and I wanted to get it done before I was done in the department because I've got a successful dissertation. Remember, in a dissertation, your experiment doesn't have to work. It just has to be hella well designed. Right, but that was the issue. So, and in replication, it didn't replicate, and it was time to abandon research and devote myself full time to teaching. So, who knows? And if any of you want to pick up where I left off, more power to you. Talk to me, and I'll help get you set up. But I got the teaching fish to fry now, and not the research game. Okay. So, are there non-conscious emotions? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. Hard to know. We don't have evidence for it. So, now I want to talk about some research I did with Marilyn Brewer and Dr. Von Hippel on white supremacists. And this is field research, and we were, again, really interested in narratives and emotion. So, this is some unpleasant business, but I guess someone had to do it, and it was a rather unpleasant time. I spent a year and a half on this research project, and we read an awful lot of messages on a white supremacist website, and it was not pleasant for any of us, me or my research assistants. Anyway, if you know where you are here, this is Nuremberg, 1945. The Allies have beaten down the Nazis. Hitler has committed suicide. The Nazis are being rounded up, and will eventually, the Nazi leaders will be prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials. Here we are at Hitler's famous Nuremberg fairgrounds, the beautiful, and the Allies. This is kind of our response to Nazism. And that's what they did. And to the life of me, just a brief kind of step off the path here. I don't understand how Nazism is gaining traction or is even allowed in this country. I mean, we've lost our fathers, we've lost our grandfathers, we lost our aunts and uncles fighting the damn Nazis. And here we have Nazis still in this country. I don't understand it, folks. But let's move on from that. One more explosion. So, Von Hippel and Brewer asked for a volunteer. They said, do we have any graduate students that would like to head up a research project on white supremacists, their websites? And for better or worse, I volunteered, and that now sucked up a good portion of my time for a year and a half. and we went to a white nationalist website. It was stormfront.org, still exists. It's been shut down a couple times. They often have to change web hosts because people say no more. No more of your stuff. It's high traffic. There was approximately 1,500 pages of messages on their discussion boards a month. And we analyzed these both for content and emotion, affect. Right? So who visits the site? Well, Nazis visit the site, white supremacists, white separatists or white nationalists, various outgroup members. And notice these are different groups and they identify themselves somewhat differently. The whites in this group all kind of view themselves as minorities in the United States. And they view themselves as victims. They're being victimized by government policies that they believe is going to turn the United States into a country of color. And this is something that they're not willing to tolerate. They believe that whites are superior in almost all these cases, and if not superior, at least whites deserve to live in a separate space, and that would be kind of the nationalists or separatists, right? So the site on this is Polifroni, Brewer, and von Hippel. This is what happens when you work with high-powered professors who don't need to publish. They allow you to take first author, and I did the bulk of the work anyway. So the narrative goal for white supremacists, and notice we've had discussion on narrative and the important. Their point of view is the racist doubled standard. Whites are made to feel guilty and hateful for loving their own people and culture. We're not racists, we are racialists, right? And it's a clever play on word because they don't want to be labeled as racists. What they want to be labeled as people who love their own people more than they love others. Unfortunately, they are still racist. Let's face it, a racist is someone who uses race as a context to understand their environment. I mean, that's it, right? So if I use race to explain an observed phenomenon, I'm engaging in racism at that moment in time. And if I do it habitually, then I'm earning the title racist. And that's just definitionally. And if people don't want to own their term, then that is kind of their issue. We can fancy it up by saying racialist, but it's the same thing, that race matters. And we know that race is a failed construct. And they suggest that they live by the 14 words. So we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So that's what they say they're about. They say they're about white pride. They say they're about love. Von Hippel, who's of a Jewish ancestry and had family in the Holocaust, as many Jews did, von Hippel, said, no, I'm not buying this. I don't think they're about love, and I don't think they're about white pride. I think they're primarily about talking shit about other groups. That is, what we're going to observe on the website is not whites are bitching. What we're going to observe primarily on the website is these other groups suck. And this is going to be pretty easy to figure out, right? Because let's face it, we've got 1,500 pages of narrative every month that we can code. And we can say, what is this message about? Is this message about white pride? Or is this message about putting down black people? Or is this message about derogating Jews? So we can count the number of messages. And we can say, look, this proportion of messages is about white pride. This proportion is about something else. And then, but we were also interested in how does the narrative affect emotion, and how is emotion used within the narrative? So we can code it. What is the primary emotional content of this message? Is this message angry? Is this message fearful? Is this message communicating disgust? So what our hope was to link the narratives about the different groups to different emotional reactions, kind of emotion action tendencies, if you will. So the methodology, well, we did a lot of background research. We coded all these messages for about a year. We got familiar with their narratives. And then we were actually going to not just do correlational research, but we were going to write our own messages, insert them. That's a manipulation, right? So now we're going to do experimental research. We're going to insert messages and then measure the responses and see if it confirms our hypothesis based on our previous year's observation of the group. So 1 month download before the experiment, 1 month introductory period as we're moving into this, the actual experiment. Insert stimulus messages every 7 to 10 days. It turned out to be every 7 days. Every Wednesday we found messages that went in on Wednesday, got the most reads and got the most responses. So we picked on Wednesdays because, you know, after a while messages fall off the bottom of the board. You guys are familiar with discussion boards, right? And then we code the messages and responses for both content, that's what's the narrative of the message, and the affect, that is what's the emotion displayed. Messages were coded by pairs of undergraduate research assistants. So I would give like, hey, here's 300 pages of messages for you guys for this month, and this pair would code these messages for content. I'd take the same 300 messages, give them to a different pair, and then they would code them independently for affect. And then what we do is they give me Excel sheets, and I could calculate the agreement between the raters. Okay? So we know that we're getting good agreements, our coding instructions are adequate, and we can also now take and link messages. What is the narrative and what is the emotion? So we could do correlational research that way. And, you know, this is a point in research where you thank people, and that's a long list of people to thank because we had a lot of messages over a long period of time, and these are all the undergraduate research assistants, among other folks, that helped with this project. So a lot of people working in our lab. It was a big project, right? So, dependent measures, what's available to us? Number of times read. Man, discussion boards are awesome because it tells you how many times this post was read. And then not only does it tell you how many times it was read, but, and that should indicate interest. Let's face it, a message that's more interesting probably gets more reads, right? And also then how many times was it responded to? So they supply us with all this great numerical information as part of the website designer construction. It really is kind of a researcher's, you know, gold mine when you get right down to it. So number of times read, number of times responses as indication of interest, and then content coding, single primary content code category. What is it about? And then the emotion that's reflected for the most part in that message. So the activities, and here's our coding scheme. If it's a rallying message, hey, come on, we gotta, you know, then that's rallying. If it's personal support speaking, hey, I got something that I need advice on, right? If it's recruiting, membership, hey, come to this other board, right? Then it's a 1.2. If it's a call to action, we need to, right? Then it gets coded a 1.3. Now the twos, we see what is the message content? Is it a threat to group, right? Or 2.1, group integrity threat, control threat. And what we found was, and I'll go on down, you can see in-group enhancement, so white pride or talking about nationalistic ideology. And then, or is it a message just simply to derogate Jews, blacks, etc.? So we got a pretty complete coding scheme, but notice we developed this coding scheme after reading like 6 months of messages, so we knew kind of the breadth of what we would find. Two things that we expected, and two things that the white supremacists circa 2002 were really likely to complain about. They believe that blacks will destroy the white race through race mixing. So black women impregnating white women causes mixed race babies, which dilutes white blood. So this is a horrible thing, and they're scared to death, right, that there will be no white blood left because it will be all the product of miscegenation. That's the fancy term for race mixing. Okay, so one narrative is, oh my God, black men impregnating white women, bad, 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 causes us to be afraid. So we can see that link. The other is about Jews, and it's about Jews having too much control. Jews control the bank. Jews control the media, right? I mean, it was a horrible read. After about a year and a half, I was fed up to here. But like, for example, their clever way they make their point is it's not the New York Times, it's the Jew York Times, right? And so they develop a hatred of the Jews for the Jewish control and the Jewish power. So we got two stories that we can look for. black-white miscegenation, and Jewish control of banking and media. Notice there was no talk about Muslims at this point in time. None whatsoever on this board. In fact, there were actual debates about Arabs being pretty damn white. Right? I know, strange. And I also learned that I thought at that point in time, before I'd done the DNA thing, that I had largely Italian heritage. And I found out that being an Italian means that I'm not considered white. That's olive skin, and that's a Mediterranean people. That's not Northern European whiteness, right? So for the first time in my life, I learned that I wasn't white, at least according to their standard. I don't know. So dependent measures then, as we see, and then when we look at the emotion, we had 9 emotion categories. No emotion displayed: anger, fear, disgust, pride, happiness, gratitude, sadness, and hate. So we're ready to go. And what did we find? We found pride, white pride, right? Number of responses on average. If someone puts in a pride message, a white pride message, and might reference a black out group like, we're so proud to be white and glad we're not black, right? Those get almost no reads, whatever. So someone reads the subject line and says, hey, white pride, not interested. People don't read it. No interest whatsoever. If we look at white pride referencing a Jewish out group, right, we get on average maybe 7 reads. They're just not interested in that. So when they tell us that our website is about white pride, that's like, no, it ain't. Because when you post white pride messages and it says so in the subject line, no one clicks on them to read them. What do they click on? What's the clickbait? You like that term? Yeah, I even know that term, right? Black-white miscegenation, oh my God. That gets the reads. That's the ones they're interested in. Jewish control of the media didn't get. And then here are a couple of our experimental, well, these are all our experimental messages, right? So we inserted these 6 messages, and this is the actual results. This last part, well, let's get to that in a minute. So, example of an experimental message. So the topic, and this is the only thing you see in the discussion board, is topic. Blacks want our women. So I write this message. Yeah, I'll take responsibility. I wrote this message, but von Hippel and I said, look, read the messages, write messages that are similar. Do not add any new information. What you're going to do is just regurgitate in different words their pre-existing opinions. We're very, very much wedded to this idea. We didn't want to add in new information. We didn't want to give them new ideas, I guess is the idea. So I post this message. It says, black want our women, and now we're going to count the number of times it's read and the number of responses it gets. These white Negro couples make me sick. I was at an Indians game, and who sat right down in front of me but a good-looking and obviously pregnant white girl with a Negro, blah, 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 blah. Just writing about it makes my skin crawl all over again. What's wrong with these white women? So this is one of their favorite narratives. That is, we need to fear, right, black men because they will impregnate white women and dilute the white race. That's their narrative, and we talked about narratives before, right? Well, when you're doing field research, right, all of a sudden the responses start rolling in, and here was a surprising response. I don't think it's so much the woman's fault as it is the Jewish-controlled media. They portray blacks as great men and as ideal. I see the same thing and it makes me want to puke. And we're like just blown away. We advance one narrative and they explain that narrative via their second narrative, which is the Jewish control of the media. So, but it allows us to see what they're about. And this is what field research on the internet looked like, at least circa 2001, right? So responses to the experimental message, emotion type, 80% of the messages coded as fear for emotion were coded as threat for content. And we say, okay, that's a pretty good use of the coding scheme. If the message is implying a threat and the emotion we see is fear, our coding scheme is okay. And then we went through and we got some basic data that isn't so important to you guys, but you know, hate and outgroup derogation have a pretty strong correlation at 60% there. The adjusted residual is a chi-square figure to test the strength of chi-squares. When you're doing this kind of qualitative research, you lose a lot of statistical power because you're using qualitative rather than quantitative techniques. But, I mean, it still makes a case. Emotion and message type, right? What do we have? Black, white, mixing. Fear was the predominant emotion observed. You know what? And that is what we hypothesized. Now, hate was also pretty large in that one as well. Pride and white pride, 79%, right? So, one thing we did do, though, is what happens if we screw the narrative up? What if we run an opposite narrative to what the website endorses as the white supremacist narrative? So in this case, we reverse the narratives. We say, blacks taking over the media. So now how many people click this, right, and read it? Whether it's magazines, the kids' school books, or the newspaper, it just seems it's all being taken over by the blacks. Whether it's about history or what's happening now, it just keeps getting blacker. When did the blacks take over all the writing? Now, this is a violation of their narrative. So we've gone in and now violated their deeply held narrative. Well, here's a response. Hey, and the first part of this message I wouldn't even put back in print. It was just disgustingly horrible language, but they're referring to black people. Can't even feed or govern themselves. They're no more behind the conspiracy you speak of than any other. But there is a mind control war raging for sure. Oy vey. And for those of you who are up on your Yiddish, oy vey is a Yiddish expression for oh my, oh well, etc. That is, it ain't the blacks, it's the Jews. So sorry, brother, you got it wrong. Here's the actual narrative. That is, we were corrected when we got the narrative wrong. But ultimately, what I'm looking at here, and the take-home point is that narratives, visceral narratives that are tied to emotion, are deeply held by groups of people, and they define these people. So white supremacists, white nationalists, Nazis engage online and repeat these narratives over and over again. Stormfront even has a children's section. You dig? They have a children's section, right? So they can repeat these and teach these narratives to the children. So, in summary, we found evidence that stereotypes can be relatively well articulated. That is, if you get the stereotype wrong, that is the narrative that invokes a stereotype, people will correct you to get them right. We also found an association between content and emotion messages in this group consistent with past research that inspired the project. So that's about enough for that. I'm going to call it good, this part, and we'll go on to the final part.